We come now to the third chapter of our textbook, which deals with non-consequentialist theories of morality, deontological theories. Deontological moral theory is a normative philosophical position that judges the morality of an action based on the actor's adherence to a rule or to a set of rules. Non-consequentialists believe that consequences do not and should not be part of the equation used to determine whether an action or the person who commits that action is moral or immoral. What is moral or immoral is determined by whether the action and the person performing that action conforms to some rule or some set of moral rules. Now, at first glance, this might seem to imply that non-consequentialists are not concerned with the consequences of their moral choices. In fact, that's pretty much the way non-consequentialism is going to be presented in this textbook. The problem is, that's not true. Everyone is concerned about the consequences of their action, the results of their moral choices. So how does a non-consequentialist differ from a consequentialist? Well, the non-consequentialist believes that obeying the moral rules will ultimately result in better consequences than disobeying the rules. So in the final analysis, non-consequentialists are just as concerned as consequentialists with the consequences of their moral choices. They're just concerned with different consequences. And we'll talk about this more later. The authors of our textbook insist that non-consequentialism holds to a major assumption that there are no general moral rules or theories, but only particular actions, situations, and people about which we cannot generalize. Well, as a non-consequentialist, I would disagree with that. Now, anthropology has discovered that there are insiders and outsiders, and someone from outside of a cultural situation cannot fairly evaluate, describe, or even understand a foreign system, a system that is foreign to them, in the way that an insider would. And the authors are talking about non-consequentialism as outsiders. This is how it appears to them. But from an insider's point of view, I would say that there is the possibility of generalization. And certainly we can generalize about situations and people. For example, we're going to talk about divine rule non-consequentialism. And the great example of this would be the Judeo-Christian moral system based as it is on the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are found in the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, in the most sacred portion of the Jewish Bible, the Torah. And you have thou shalt not kill. But what outsiders sometimes do not understand is that most of the Torah is spent giving us examples as to how we are to generalize and apply these rules in the variety of situations in which we face. Thou shalt not kill, literally thou shalt not murder, may seem pretty cut and dried. But sometimes people are killed in a variety of circumstances. Are there no exceptions to this rule? Well, as you read the Torah, you find out that there is case law that explains that the rule is to be applied with a certain amount of flexibility. So an outsider sees the rule and says, that's so inflexible. But when we look at the Torah, we find there is flexibility in the actual application of the rule. So non-consequentialism does not demand a rigidity that says there are not difficult situations. There are not people who find themselves in difficult situations. What about that person who doesn't know the moral rules and yet breaks them? How do we deal with such a person? Certainly, what is appropriate in one context may not be appropriate in another. And so as a non-consequentialist hearing this, I would say if this is a charge being leveled against us, we're not guilty. We can generalize about people and situations, and the application of absolute rules sometimes demands a flexibility that those critiquing the non-consequentialists do not allow for or generally understand. We're going to begin by talking about a theory known as Intuitionism. Early on, we introduced you to the philosopher Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is an intuitionist. Intuitionism is very similar in many ways to natural law theory, which is a religious-based theory primarily. It's the idea that we have moral instinct. We have moral intuitions. We're born with them, unless there is something malfunctioning in our brain damage somewhere along the way. We have an intuitive sense of right and wrong. The author says one must approach each situation individually and decide on the right action. Well, it isn't really much of a deciding process. Intuitionists believe that individuals will know intuitively the right thing to do in each situation they find themselves in. So it is not whether we, a matter of having to decide now what is right or wrong here. Intuitionism says the decision is, am I going to do the right thing or not? There's a great movie that was made years ago, won Academy Awards, called The Scent of a Woman. And there is a great climactic scene in this great movie in which the hero of this movie says, I always knew the right thing to do. Without exception, I knew the right thing. I didn't do it because it was too damn hard. Now, an intuitionist would say exactly right. We have an intuition, a moral intuition. We intuitively know right from wrong. And the question is, are we going to do it? The authors say correctly that in the intuitionist system, moral decisions are intuitionistic, which they say means a person decides on a particular situation based on his or her intuition about what is right. And again, there is this intuitive understanding of it. We don't decide what is right or wrong to do in a situation. We know it. For the intuitionist, the question is, are we going to do it? Reasons in support of the theory of intuitionism. The authors write, any well-meaning person seems to have an immediate sense of right and wrong. And this is actually what Intuitionism teaches. What I stated just a few minutes ago, that when we find ourselves in a situation, when we find ourselves on the horns of a moral dilemma, we know what the right thing is. We know what the wrong thing is. The test of our character is whether or not we are going to do what we intuitively know to be right, or whether we are going to ignore our moral intuition and do the wrong thing. An argument in favor of this is human beings had moral ideas and convictions long before they developed systems of ethics. And that is just historically true. The systems came later. Where did they come from? Why did human beings say there needs to be a rule against this? There needs to be a law against this. There needs to be a punishment for someone who would violate that law. Where did that come from? And the intuitionist would say the rules and laws of a culture are the outward expression of inborn moral intuitions. We intuitively know what is right and wrong. We know wrong when we see it, and when we see enough of it, rules are created to curb those who would have the impulse to do those things that we all know intuitively we ought not to be doing. The authors of our text go on to say, our reasoning on moral matters usually is used to confirm our intuitions, and this is also a fair statement of what intuitionists believe. Where does reason come in? Deciding what is right or wrong? No, the intuitionists would say we as human beings have a tremendous ability to rationalize the wrong things we do. Rationalism is proof that we have an uneasy conscience because you don't have to rationalize the right thing. It's self-obvious. Now, people might want an explanation, and we might be able to give a reason for our actions, but as soon as that reason is known, if it is morally valid, people are going to shake their head and say, oh, okay, I understand. Because an intuitionist would say, right action is self-obvious to any right-thinking individual. Right thinking, we mean other than psychopaths, sociopaths, people with severe brain damage. We all have an inborn pre-wiring, as Haidt said, to be righteous. We have the voice of conscience, which is the mouthpiece of morality, saying there are things we ought to do and things we ought not to do. Reasoning kicks in when we say, well, I know that my intuition says I should do this. But in this case, I think I have a really good reason not to. And so when a person finds themselves rationalizing, so the intuitionist would say, that's evidence that they know at a intuitive level that they are doing something or they have done something wrong, because you don't have to rationalize those things that are right. So reasoning kicks in after the fact. Intuition is the immediate response. The intuitionist would also point out that our reasoning can't go wrong in relation to moral issues. And when that happens, we fall back on our moral insights and intuitions. I would maybe take insights out of there. We fall back on our moral intuitions. What are we talking about here? We're talking about those rules in a culture that we would see and say, you know, there is just something wrong about this. Or we hear an argument saying we should do something, and yet the reasoning seems sound, but we intuitively sense there is something wrong with that reasoning. And in that case, we even if we cannot perhaps come up with the rational argument to show why the person is wrong in what they're saying, at a gut level, we realize there's something wrong with it. And in such cases, we go with our intuition, our gut, rather than with what our mind is telling us. You can come up with a reasoned argument for just about anything. We talked about that when we talked about consequentialism and utilitarianism. And someone might come up with a very reasonable sounding argument for slavery. And we may not be able to really come up with a reason-based argument against their position. Our arguments against it may be completely emotion-based. How would you feel if someone made a slave of you? Think of how that slave feels. Think of what you would feel like if you were a slave. Those arguments have an emotional power, but they're really not reason-based. So why do we fall back to these emotion-based arguments? How would you feel? Put yourself in the other person's shoes. Do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. Ayn Rand, the ego ethicist, held the position that that's just pure nonsense. And she made a good logical case for it. That was her big thing, objectivism. What do you do? Well, people have this intuition. There is something wrong with the thought of owning another human being. I may not be able to come up with a rationally defensible counter-argument to your argument, but something in my gut says this is wrong. And I think something in your gut says it's wrong too. That's why you come up with this argument. You have to. You're rationalizing. Because at some deep level, you know that you are wrong. Otherwise, you wouldn't be trying to excuse yourself using your reason to do it. The intuitionist Jonathan Haidt has come up with an illustration to show us how our moral intuitions interact with our reason or our rational nature. The illustration is the elephant and the rider. I took this photo when I was in India. We visited a wildlife refuge there, and here you see an elephant and its rider. Haidt compares our moral intuitions to the elephant and our reason to the rider. Now you can see this rider has a sharp stick in his hand, and this is to control the elephant should the elephant go somewhere he doesn't want it to go. The elephant here has just finished some work, and it's headed for the water hole, so it really doesn't need much prodding, and so the rider is pretty much inactive, just riding on the back of the elephant doing nothing. But the elephant could see something that would cause it to lurch, and when it lurches, the rider's job is to either go with that or to get the elephant back on track. Haidt says that our moral intuitions are like that elephant. We intuitively see something, we know it's wrong, and when it does, our elephant lurches. Now, it's probably a good idea, both in real life and in the moral realm, to go with the elephant when it lurches. But if you're not going to do that, then you need to use that sharp stick, or you need to climb down behind the elephant's ears and use your feet to steer it. You need to do something to get that lurching elephant back on the path it needs to be. And so our reason rides the elephant. Someone asks us, why did you go that way? Well, the elephant lurched that way, but you're not going to say that. You know, we live in a very rationalistic age. You're not going to normally say, well, I just felt it was right to do it. Instead, you're going to come up with some rational explanation for what you did. And if it's the right thing, it's going to be self-obvious. People are going to accept that and say, oh, okay, now I understand. But let's say the elephant lurches and you don't want to go with the instinct of the elephant. And so you do everything you can to get it back in line. And that is rationalization. Now, Haidt doesn't call it that because he sometimes thinks that the elephant does need to be retrained and its instincts curbed. A natural rights theorist, and I come from that point of view, would say leave the elephant alone. The elephant is right. You can trust your moral intuitions. If you have a moral intuition that something is wrong, go with that. It's a good idea to go with the elephant when it lurches, but again, Haidt and others would say not always. But Haidt would say that the rational process kicks in after the fact to explain the actions of the elephant or our actions in refusing to go with the actions of the elephant. The authors of our textbook do not accept Intuitionism per se. There's some things in Intuitionism that they find useful and are going to bring forward into their own moral theory. But as a standalone theory, the authors have some problems with Intuitionism, and so they critique it strongly. They begin by saying that Intuitionism lacks scientific or philosophical respectability. Well, if that is true, and I don't believe it is not an argument. It is an observation, and it's actually a little bit snobbish. The philosophical respectability the authors are talking about here, with all due respect, you have an intuitionist such as Jonathan Haidt teaching at an Ivy League institution, the University of Virginia, and though the University of California, Bakersfield is a fine academic institution, I would say it is probably not as prestigious as the University of Virginia. Why do I mention the University of California, Berkeley? Well, that was the place that the primary author of our textbook, Jacques Thoreau, taught at until his death in 2006. And scientific respectability, we'll talk about that. The authors say there is no proof that we have an inborn or innate sense of morality. Well, that's no longer true. Proof, well, it's impossible to prove anything conclusively, but the fact is there is a growing body of hard empirical evidence that we do indeed have an innate sense of morality. You're going to see some of this in a video that I'm going to ask you to watch and comment on in the discussion board on this chapter. So there is some scientific evidence and a growing body of scientific evidence that would lend force to the arguments of the intuitionists. Conclusive proof? No, but there is good evidence. And philosophical respectability? Well, I guess that would depend on what philosopher you ask. The authors also say that intuitionism is immune to criticism because it applies only to the possessor. And here they're trying to say that it is not a scientific theory because it can't be falsified. And they're suggesting, as they do in the textbook, that intuitionists teach that everyone has their own unique moral intuition, and the authors have stated that they fear moral anarchy, so they would believe that intuitionism is a prescription for the very moral anarchy they fear. But again, they're painting with too broad a brush. It may be that there are some intuitionists out there that teach individualism as well as intuitionism, but it is certainly not true of all intuitionists, and it's not true of an intuitionist such as Jonathan Haidt, for example. The authors say human beings without a moral intuition would have no means of establishing morality on any other ground. Well, the argument of the intuitionists is all normal people are born with moral intuition. So those who don't have it are psychopaths. And you're right, we're not going to come up with a moral system that is going to work for psychopaths. The authors of our textbook are going to propose a moral system that they think is a good one. It wouldn't work for psychopaths either. So people without a moral intuition, without a conscience, are not going to be impacted by the wisdom of any moral system that would seek to hold them in check. The evidence is suggesting very strongly that people without a moral intuition would be a real anomaly. Such a condition would be an abnormality. And as we said, what system's going to work for a person without a conscience? The authors now make some arguments that I think are pretty good arguments. They're epistemological arguments. Epistemology, you remember, is how we know. How can we know with no other guide than our moral intuition that what we are feeling is morally correct? The inward elephant lurches for sure. But how do we know that our moral instincts are truly moral? It's a very good question. How do we know? I would suggest that the answer to that is we have a lot of human history, and our moral intuitions seem to be confirmed by history, and we could say in our own history. The intuitionists would say, and really perhaps the natural law theorists would say, and the two are related, not identical as we've discussed earlier, but they would say that in my own life I have seen that better consequences come from obeying or going with the lurching of my elephant than resisting it and going the other way. My moral instincts have proved to be a reliable guide. I have found myself in more trouble when I ignore my conscience than when I say, okay, the elephant's lurching, let's go with it. And I've often, after the fact, felt enormous guilt when I did not go with the lurching of my elephant, because I have seen that that would have been the right choice, and I often regret that I didn't go with it. And if we cannot trust our moral instincts, then what is the basis for any moral system? Because throughout history we seem to be, as our author's pointing out, striving for goodness over badness, and that has always been understood instinctually before there were moral codes or ethical systems that gave voice and expression to our moral intuitions. So perhaps we cannot know in any absolute sense, but what can we know in any absolute sense? But when we look at things pragmatically on the basis of does it work, it would seem that our moral intuitions work pretty well. And it works pretty well for us to go with our conscience rather than to ignore it. The author then raises this: how do we know we have sufficient facts to make a moral decision? Well, that's certainly true. Have you ever had your inner moral elephant lurch and you say, that's terrible? But then someone says, wait a minute, and they give you additional facts, and your elephant calms down when it gets more information because it realizes, okay, well that's different. I didn't know that. Never mind. So the author is right. It does make sense to be sure that we have the necessary facts before we jump to a moral conclusion. The authors then make an argument that I don't think is quite so good, and it shows a certain lack of understanding of Intuitionism. They say, with morality so highly individualized, how can we know we are doing the best thing for everyone else involved in a particular situation? Whoa, a couple things there. Notice, for example, how can we know we're doing the best for everyone else involved in a particular situation? Think back, what moral system is that the authors are referencing? It is utilitarianism. And here you have one of those little insights into the author's bias. It's going to become more obvious as we move into the presentation of their moral theory in chapter 8. The authors are consequentialists, and they are, in many respects, they are utilitarian, although they are also egoethicists. There is a synthesis of the two in our author's moral system. But they're saying here that, it sounds to me like you're proposing egoethicicism. And if that's the case, how can we accomplish utilitarianism? Well, intuitionists don't claim that everyone has their own individual moral elephant, different from everyone else's moral elephant. The argument is we all have the same elephant within us, that our moral instincts are identical. And as we talked with Jonathan Haidt, this is what the cross-cultural evidence is indicating. And there have been studies done at Yale, their baby lab. And again, you're going to be seeing a video on this as part of our next discussion board. The Yale baby lab studies are very interesting in that they would show that we do have apparently pretty much the same moral intuition. So moral intuition is not highly individualized. It's uniform. And this is why it's possible for us to have cross-cultural relationships. is because we do have certain moral instincts so that we can relate meaningfully and ethically with other human beings, even though those human beings may come from a completely different culture than the one we were enculturated into. The authors continue their critique by asking, can we really rely on nothing more than our momentary feelings to help us make moral decisions? Yeah, why not? Why can't we trust our conscience? It would seem that if we have this moral intuition, and it seems that we do have it, seems that we have the voice of conscience that is telling us there are certain things we ought to do and certain things we ought not to do. Since this seems to be our instinct, it would seem reasonable to me that we can trust our instinct. A bird with an instinct to fly south in the winter, can it really rely on nothing more than its momentary feeling, instinct, to make the decision to fly south? Well, I suppose it could wait around until the snow begins to fall and its wings begin to ice, but it has that instinct for a reason. The sucking instinct that human babies have all over the world, every culture. Put your finger on its cheek, it's going to turn and begin to try to draw nourishment from that which has touched its little cheek. This is true of newborns all over the world. It's an instinct. Can that infant really trust nothing more than its momentary feeling that if it turns there, there's nourishment to make the decision to do that? Well, it better trust it or it's going to die. The point I'm making is instincts have a purpose, whether those instincts are found in the other creatures that share this planet with us or whether there is something intuitive in our understanding of things. And the evidence is pointing to the fact that we do have a moral intuition, a moral instinct. It must be there for a reason. And it would seem that instincts have to do with the well-being and even the survival of a particular creature. So can we rely on our instincts is what the author is really asking here. And I would say, why not? Now, Jonathan Haidt and I would part company here because he, being a having different positions than I do on a number of issues, social issues, he would say that sometimes we just can't trust that elephant. And the elephant needs to be trained and retrained and taught that it shouldn't lurch at certain things. My position would be if the elephant has the facts, you can trust your elephant. Go with it. Why not? But it is also true, as will be demonstrated by a non-consequentialist by the name of Immanuel Kant. We're going to look at his theories that our moral instincts are not irrational. So we don't have to just make our moral decisions based on our momentary feelings, because if we think things through, Kant has demonstrated that there is a rationality behind our moral instincts. The author says, how will we be able to justify our actions except by saying that it felt like the right thing to do? Well, as I've said earlier, why do you need to justify your actions? You don't have to justify your action if it is clearly the right thing. Someone may need additional information. They need more of the facts because their elephant may be lurching. You did something and they say, why did you do that? And so their inward elephant is saying you've done something wrong. But when all the facts are in, you don't need to justify doing the right thing. If I help a little old lady, I'm getting to be a little old man, someone's going to have to help me someday, but if I help a little old lady across the street, I don't have to justify doing that. You don't have to justify anything except not going with your moral intuition. So justification is only necessary for those who have a guilty conscience, because their conscience is telling them you ought not to do that, or you should not have done that. So that's how I'd handle that particular